I'm going to introduce Rachel, and then we're going to reorganize the stage a little bit so we could have our discussion. If we have time at the end of our discussion, I do look forward to taking questions from the audience. But Rachel is here this morning because her book, Strangers to Ourselves, Unsettled Minds, and the Stories That Make Us, is as good as a book as I've ever read on mental illness. And for better or worse, I've read a lot of them, and this is as good as any. And as I stand here, the paperback edition, which each of you have, is currently in the top 10 of the New York Times paperback list. So other people seem to think that as well. And just a program note, Rachel will be available after the discussion to sign your book if you would like that. Strangers to Ourselves delicately balances two truths that prove to be remarkably difficult to hold in tandem. We all have our own minds, our own experiences, our own suffering, and we are also social creatures who live among others, and social forces have at least some bearing on how we understand who we are. Rachel suggests that we continue to cling to reductive theories about brain chemistry because, in her words from the book, the reality that mental illness is caused by an interplay between biological, genetic, psychological, and environmental factors is more difficult to conceptualize. And that's what the New York Times had to say about Rachel's book. We are excited to be able to have the conversation with Rachel Aviv this morning, an author and staff writer at The New Yorker, a two-time finalist for the National Magazine Award of Public Interest, a 2022 recipient of the National Magazine Award for Profile Writing, a 2019 National Fellow at New America, and author of Strangers to Ourselves, Unsettled Minds, and the Stories That Make Us, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and named one of the top 10 books of the year by both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. As I said earlier, this is one of my favorite books of the year and as good as any book I've ever read about mental illness and recovery. The book was eagerly devoured by my colleagues and friends and family and professionals and lay people. Rachel's book probes her own and others' mental health stories, examining the internal emotional landscapes and external responses which our subjects experience and illuminating those which can help, heal, or harm. Rachel's book recounts a foundational period in our conceptions of mental health and mental illness over the past century and is well-timed as we look forward to the coming century, which promises rapid change in the field of mental health. I think this book is important in that it poses fundamental questions about how we understand ourselves, not only how we understand and address illness and crisis, but how we think about normalcy in our mental health and the necessity of appreciating the socio-cultural context of our stories. With no further ado, as we also set the stage, Rachel Aviv. Well, here we are, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction.
You and me and 300 of our closest friends. So before we get started, where are you from? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Michigan, right outside of Detroit.
Okay, all right. And what was your neighborhood like?
What was my neighborhood like? I'm not a very descriptive.
You wouldn't know that from your writing.
My parents lived like 6 blocks away from each other, so I could bike down the
Okay,
block
all right.
from one house to another house.
All right.
Yeah.
And why did you become a journalist?
I think I always wanted to be a writer, and in college, I started reading nonfiction books that I realized it was the first time I realized there was a genre of writing that could kind of read like a novel, but it was all true. And so that kind of writing was very compelling to me. And the idea that you sort of read about characters that exist in the real world, and through reading it changes your relationship with that particular type of person was exciting to me.
All right, all right. Well, let's move on to talk about the book. And before I ask you to describe the book, I'd like to read something that you wrote in the book to set it up.
Yeah.
Mental illnesses are often seen as chronic and intractable forces that take over our lives. But I wonder how much the stories we tell about them, especially in the beginning, can shape their course. People can feel freed by these stories, but they can also feel stuck in them. Rachel, tell us about the book. Describe it if you would.
Well, that particular passage comes from this complicated experience that I had when I was 6. I stopped eating for a couple days, and my parents took me to the pediatrician. And this was the late 80s when anorexia felt like a very sort of pervasive idea. And so at age 6, the doctor diagnosed me with anorexia, and I was put in a hospital with these older girls. And one of the girls was 13 and I was 6, so I kind of like modeled myself after her. And when I was reporting the book, I went back and I interviewed my doctors and psychiatrists from the hospital where they had this anorexia unit. And I asked about this older girl named Hava, and they all became, very quiet and kind of awkward. And it had turned out that she had died 6 weeks earlier, had never recovered from anorexia. And then I went and read all of her journals, that she'd kept journals in all her hospital stays. And in one journal, I actually saw her writing about the 6-year-old me. And it just felt like this really profound experience of reading her journals and relating so much to what was happening to her in that moment. And we were sort of sharing a lot in that moment. We shared doctors, we shared environment, our family dynamics were quite similar. We'd come from similar sort of cultural backgrounds. And it really felt to me like, what were the differences? What made it so that, like, for me, anorexia was this kind of blip or aberration in my life? And for her, it became a kind of career. It really defined who she was. And so that line you read felt to me like, it's often so little that determines why one person can sort of move on and another person really feels stuck and defined by a diagnosis.
Thank you. One of the things we work very hard in the community system to keep people out of the hospital. Unfortunately, sometimes that's where they need to be, but we work hard to prevent that. And one of the reasons we work hard to prevent it is sometimes, particularly for young people, it's actually a boot camp in how to be ill.
Mm-hmm.
And I recall reading in your book that as a 6-year-old, you didn't have the language to describe what you were going through, and you learned for better and worse from your older peers. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I found that like a really remarkable fact. And when I was reading my old medical records, the psychiatrists were quite curious why a 6-year-old would become anorexic. So there was, maybe it was something about my parents' divorce and the family dynamic, or maybe it was something about my genetics. But what no psychiatrist was really looking at was how did the very fact that I was labeled anorexic and then put in an environment in which the authority figures or the mentors for me were these older anorexic girls. How did that affect the course of the illness, myself, my sense of self? I know I didn't know what the word anorexia was. I remember thinking it was like a dinosaur of some sort because it sounded like it. And there was something both like ennobling about getting this like big word that was applied to me. And then these girls who I saw as really beautiful taught me like, this is what you do. This is exercise. Exercise relates to calories. Calories relates to fat. Like they sort of taught me a lot about the body that I didn't even know, and that sort of enriched my understanding of, what it meant to be anorexic and what I was trying to do. It was like a new value system. So I think it was really surprising that the doctors thought that like sort of being placed in this milieu could be healing.
I had this experience during the pandemic because of the position that I hold. I get a lot of inquiries about people seeking service. And early on in the pandemic, I got a lot of calls from families uh, who typically their young daughters were struggling with eating disorders. And I noticed that early on. And then I noticed how when society opened up, I couldn't go anywhere, and I mean anywhere, without someone approaching me if they knew what I did, asking for assistance with their loved one with the eating disorder. Again, typically young woman. And I was trying to think what was going on, and obviously the stress and the uneasiness and the loneliness of the pandemic. But the other thing that struck me, particularly for young people, social media had become a boot camp in how to suffer from an eating disorder. And a lot of these young women and men, it was typically young women, but also young boys, were learning from social media the language of an eating disorder, the language of restricting food, the language of being thin to an unhealthy extent. And, I just wanted to bring that out because that's not good. And, that's something that we need to pay attention to. And in, reading your book, Rachel, as you just discussed, it's obvious how your own experience has influenced this book, as well as your adult experience in receiving treatment with medication. So I wanted to ask you a little more about those experiences, particularly as an adult now, has influenced this book. And I was very struck by something you wrote in your second grade journal. You were a journalist then, but didn't know it. And you wrote the following as a second grader, and I wish I could write this good and this concise now. I had anorexia because I want to be someone better than me.
It's probably still true. No, not the anorexia part. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think was there a question, or should I just respond to
Just
it?
respond.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I have two thoughts. One is I was really interested in this tradition of sort of thinking about anorexia as the historical parallels with mystics and sort of people who through fasting felt like they were becoming kind of exalted versions of themselves, and that we don't often think, we're so quick to think about anorexia in terms of media images of thin women, but that there's this other thread that relates to sort of religious experience and the experience of fasting, and sort of purifying oneself. And I felt like that aspect of anorexia had not been sort of teased out that much. And then I guess the other thought I'm having is how much mental illnesses get confused with our own like aspirations for who we want to be. And I mean that I guess that there was some sense that the way I was living was not right, that I could be better, and I was sort of grabbing the wrong equipment for how to achieve that.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, I think it was about 2010, Dr. Sylvia Riskin, the late great Sylvia Riskin, one of our board members, who died in 2020 at 103 years old. She was the first woman to get a doctorate in psychology from Columbia University, and she was on our board. And she used to send me magazine articles, like the actual magazine. She'd put it in the mail. And I think it was about 2010, I received a Harper's magazine that included one of your articles that caught my attention. First, it had the endorsement of Sylvia Riskin, which was a big deal, at least in my life. And that article is "Which Way Madness Lies: Can Psychosis Be Prevented?" And if you could talk a little bit about that, and was that kind of the beginning of your interest that eventually led to the book?
Yeah. In that piece, I interviewed young people who were in clinics for the earliest stages of psychosis, which was called the prodromal phase. And something that I found so striking when I was talking to these people was that they were really struggling with language. They couldn't kind of I would say, when did you first feel that there was something off, or that you were sort of starting to lose your sense of self? And I remember one person said to me, there are no words. It's like trying to explain what a bark sounds like to someone who's never heard of a dog. There was just a sense of how incommunicable some of these experiences were, and the very fact of that incommunicability making them feel more alone and more stigmatized. So I think it was working on that story that kind of made me, I think at that time I thought, I'm going to write a book. And then it took like 15 years. But I was also interested in when your experience is so hard to articulate and then you are given a diagnosis, there's a sense of like, well, my experience is so slippery. Maybe this is how I describe what I'm going through. Like maybe I will just accept these words. And I was interested in the kind of mismatch or the gap between like that core experience of distress that is so hard to put into words and the classification that you are given. And are there times where, because you don't really know how to express it, you sort of accept the expert interpretation, which is not like quite the right fit, but it's something. But I wanted to try to get as close as I could to what that original experience was.
And then in 2017, my friend Ann Portis, I believe, sent me an article that appeared in the New Yorker, and it was called "The Trauma of Facing Deportation," was about resignation syndrome and the children there, the refugees. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So I became interested. I just read an article, and I think it was a medical journal, about these children in Sweden who, when their families were denied asylum, these were children whose families had come from former Soviet states. And when the families applied for asylum in Sweden and did not get it, the children would all develop these symptoms that were oddly similar from one family to another. And they would stop speaking, they would get into their beds, they would stop moving, they would stop eating, and eventually they would slip into states that were sort of like comas or sort of catatonic. And so I went to Sweden and I started talking to these families and talking to the doctors that studied these families. And there was some element where I felt like a sense of connection, like, oh, I did something a little bit similar when I was 6, where I just kind of protested what was going on in life by refusing to eat and kind of refusing to participate in life. And I became interested in, how in Sweden there was this particular diagnosis that the families knew about. And the diagnosis also, once they got it, they could use that as grounds to get asylum. So it was very complicated. There was like a bit of a secondary gain to the diagnosis. And I didn't think any of the children were pretending, like it was quite real and profound. But I became very interested in how there are sort of scripts through which distress can be expressed. And so resignation syndrome kind of offered a particular way for these children to express their sense of helplessness and their sense of chaos and fear. And so they sort of followed these steps, not consciously, but it kind of was this confusing interactive dynamic between the diagnosis and the explanation and between the experience of, pain.
Which kind of sets up the book because much of your book is about that, and the book is far from being anti-psychiatry.
Mhm.
It acknowledges the positive impact that psychiatry and furthermore medication has had on people's lives, but also acknowledges the limitations of psychiatry and what we do, and frankly, the failure of elitism, depending on where this psychiatry is being practiced. So it has, you wrote about 5 people, I believe. And initially, I saw the table of contents and I said, oh, Rachel has done a series of case studies. But as you have also commented, after reading them, I said they're not case studies, they're family stories. What about these stories are family stories?
I think there's one of my favorite stories in the book was this story of a mother in India in the 70s who developed a real kind of a gift for mystical poetry, and she was really celebrated by her community for that poetry. But at the same time, she was sort of slipping away and running away from her family, who would send the police to get her, and she was diagnosed with schizophrenia when they would get her. And so I ended up spending a lot of time with her with her daughter and her son, and just the way that mental illness cannot be localized in an individual. Like this mother's mental illness had roots in her own upbringing and her own society, and then her children basically spent their lives processing what had happened to their mother, and whether they were abandoned or whether they could forgive her. It felt like, to think about mental illnesses as an entity that exists in one person's brain kind of really neglects the way that it's held by an entire family, and it goes through many generations, sort of processing and dealing with, a sense of it shapes the entire family story. And it didn't feel like I could write a case study, that like the very idea of a case study was that was a fallacy.
One of the Bapu, right, was the gentle lady's name. Uh, I found her story very interesting. Uh, but I also read, I believe, in the book that you noted that research seems to indicate that the outcomes for schizophrenia in India are better than they are in the United States. And, I think that's because in India has the culture, they're far more accepting of the disorder, and families are far more involved. And I think that's why we see better outcomes in India as well as other parts of the world. And another thing that fascinates me, recent research is coming out in regards to the hallucinations that are associated with psychosis. A lot of it is contingent on your culture. Like in India and Ghana, for example, auditory hallucinations are far more passive and actually affirming. In the United States, they tend to be more about violence or the church or the temple or government. So, what does that tell us?
I think it also relates to in the United States, the idea of the self is quite bounded. Like you don't want anyone interfering with your sense of self. Whereas in India, there's more of a sense of the self can be a bit more porous. So it doesn't feel like such a violation or such a sign of insanity if there are voices you hear from outside.
One of my first jobs was at St. Catherine's Infirmary, which was a convent. And for lack of a better way of putting it, it was an old folks' home for nuns. And there was about 70 nuns up there in the 1970s when I was working there. And there was 3 or 4 nuns that I didn't know then because I didn't have the language for it, but were suffering from active schizophrenia. And I mean active schizophrenia, hallucinations. And these other nuns just supported him,
Yeah.
and they just lived among them. And, once in a while, if they engaged in bizarre behavior or wandered into town, it was no big deal. They were just continued to be supportive. And those particular nuns were able to live old and enriching lives. So let's move to America. And one of the people you write about is Ray, who's kind of an historical figure in the history of psychiatry. Could you tell us about Ray?
Um, Ray was this doctor who was very successful in the 70s, but became increasingly depressed and sort of obsessed with life decisions that he felt he had messed up. And so he was treated at Chestnut Lodge, which at the time was seen as like the pinnacle of psychiatric treatment. Sorry, one second.
So take your time. I think I'll join you.
Um, it was a place where you could get psychoanalysis 4 days a week, and the entire institution was set up to sort of support psychoanalytic theories. And but he kept getting worse as they kept trying to get to the root of his personality problems. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. Take your time.
I don't have any viruses that you can worry about. Um,
People often have this reaction to me. So don't.
um,
Right, Chuck?
Anyway, his case represented like the collision between between a biological psychiatry. Is that a cough drop? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Uh, because the Chestnut Lodge did not treat him with medication, he eventually sued them, and his case came to represent sort of the two tides in psychiatry, the psychoanalysis versus biological psychiatry. Now I'm going to let you talk for a second so I can.
Yeah. So, as many of us know, there's been a tension in the field our whole career between the psychoanalytic aspects of the field and the medical biological aspects of the field. And particularly when Dr. Riccioli and I were first starting out, there was various camps concerning this. And I think through the years, we've learned better, and that it really takes a eclectic, holistic approach to treat a human being. And it's not either or, it's together. But back in the late 70s, early 80s, that wasn't quite clear. And this gentleman, Ray, and as a service provider, it's important that we treat everyone with compassion and meet them where they are. But one of the things about Ray, and I wonder what your experience was as a journalist, boy, he's not a likable guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a proper diagnosis might have related to having a personality disorder, which is a really difficult diagnosis to deal with because it's not easily treatable, and it also makes people annoyed. And so he kind of, the psychoanalyst treating him just kind of had an oppositional attitude toward him. And I think that also affected why they weren't able to like puncture his sense of deep loneliness.
One of the things that I've always struggled with my whole career, to be honest with you, the first 10 or 15 years of my career, I don't know if I ever thought about it, but I struggle with it now. And it wasn't necessarily with ill intent, though some of it I'm sure was. A lot of the treatment that's provided for mental health really was developed through the prism of a Caucasian male.
Yeah.
Now, I have nothing against Caucasian males, I am one, but that's relatively reductive and isn't in the best interest of a large portion of society, and we need to do better than that and be able to meet people where they are. And I thought one of the family stories that are particularly tragic, as a result of our inability to do that or limited ability to do that, frankly, there was some horrendous outcomes, and the gentle lady didn't get the treatment that she deserved or needed until she was incarcerated. So if you can tell us a bit about Naomi and how you found her.
Yeah, so Naomi was a young mother of four children when she was 24. And she sort of had this awakening where she felt like, oh, I understand what it is to be a Black mother raising children in America. And I understand that my children are going to live lives that they'll be ridiculed. And she began reading about the history of racism in America and felt like she understood her life in a new way. But this dawning awareness kind of coincided with her having a psychotic break that was related to postpartum psychosis. um, and she ended up jumping off a bridge with two of her twin children. And one died and the other one survived, and so she was arrested. And um, I guess 2 points. I mean, one is she had been seen by she had been hospitalized several times before this happened, but she had never really been treated. And I think there was this problem where her depression wasn't really taken seriously because she was talking about, I don't have someplace to live, I'm having fights with my ex-husband. And if she had been I write about this other woman who went to Harvard and she was white, and she sort of immediately when she had distress, it was medicalized and it was seen as depression. But when Naomi, this young mother, went to the hospitals, it was seen as like, oh, she has a hard life. Like she's okay. She's responding to like legitimately stressful things in her life. But then after this crime, she wanted to plead guilty by reason of insanity. And when she would talk about her life and the events that led up to this psychotic break, she would make really profound sociological observations about what it's like to be Black in America. And so the doctors, instead of thinking she was psychotic, thought like, oh, this was a protest. This was her sort of rejecting the society she lived in. So she could not plead guilty. She was in prison. For more than a decade. And while she was in prison, she actually ended up developing relationships with psychologists and sort of recovered in a way that was um, sort of met people who were able to like hold those truths. Like, yes, experiencing, you are suffering because of racism and discrimination and poverty, but also you have a mental illness and you need to take medications, and sort of the clarity of vision that you have when you are psychotic is like to that level is not allowing you to sort of do the things that will make you want to be sort of allow you to be a parent to your children.
Do I recall correctly that it was actually the prison librarian
Yeah.
who had a relationship with Naomi that was able to encourage her to develop some insight into her psychosis?
Yeah, there was an incredible librarian at the prison in Minnesota, and she would give Naomi books to read. And, one thing that helped Naomi was just realizing like other Black women had experienced depression. Like she just had no context. She felt like, depression is like a white person's disease. It's like Black women are not supposed to, we should just be strong enough. We don't need to be depressed. And I think reading this literature and having a librarian who sort of saw her on multiple levels, like intellectual, spiritual, medical. And then when Naomi did have a really bad episode where she stopped taking her medications and became quite psychotic, that librarian visited her and said something like, Naomi, I don't see you. I don't recognize this person. And I think having someone that Naomi really knew well and trusted allowed her to begin taking medications in a way that just some stranger, like she wouldn't have trusted that person's assessment of what was happening.
One of the most devastating impacts of mental illness or addiction or an untreated eating disorder is loneliness. And I think one of the themes that runs through this book is loneliness. And I imagine that wasn't an accident. Was that something you conceptualized?
It's funny. I went through each chapter and I thought about like what ideas are traveling through each chapter and how am I sort of treating ideas as characters. And I remember thinking loneliness was a kind of like character that was moving through each chapter. And there's an essay that's amazing by Frida Fromm Reichman where she called On Loneliness, and she writes about how psychiatrists have not really addressed loneliness as a phenomenon. And one of the reasons why is because real loneliness at its core is just such a terrifying idea. It's like sort of naked human existence, that in a way psychiatrists don't want to be contaminated by it, by like really thinking about what is the experience of loneliness. And I think, in these five stories, something that felt profound was that the moment in which someone found some kinship with someone or some sense of connection, um, that was really essential to their recovery. And it felt like the recovery actually didn't happen without that.
And one of the things we struggle with as providers is typically Medicaid, Medicare, the managed care companies, the commercial insurance companies. They don't want to pay for the alleviation of loneliness.
Yeah.
And it's a really a central aspect of what we do, being there for our consumers and just having that personal relationship. But before I open it up to the audience for questions, I did want to acknowledge that Assemblywoman Tucker is with us this morning. Assemblywoman Tucker has been one of our biggest supporters and is particularly active in the veterans space and in supporting women's veterans. And I just saw her, I think, 2 days ago at our facility in Parsippany with Emerson Crook. So thank you, Assemblywoman, and thank you very much for being here. And I don't know if he left, but the police chief of West Orange, Jim Abbott, was also with us. So having said that, any questions for Rachel? Any brave souls? Sir?
What did you mean when you just said that psychiatrists didn't want to be contaminated by the concept of loneliness?
The gentleman wants to know what
yeah,
Rachel
that's a
meant by
question.
the concept that the
Yeah.
psychiatrist didn't want to be contaminated by loneliness.
Like when you really open yourself up to someone's experience of loneliness, you have to feel it. You have to enter that space. And I think that's what Frida Fromm-Reichmann meant, is that like it was almost like the psychiatrist didn't want to know it, like didn't want to really listen, because to really listen means you have to acknowledge this like terrifying phenomenon.
And that could be difficult if you're the receptionist. It's not just about the psychiatrist.
No. Yeah, it could be
It's-
anyone. Yes. Yeah. I mean, a friend.
Right.
Yeah.
Emerson?
In dealing with your anorexic, at what point did you realize that you need to make that paradigm shift? And what brought you to that?
I mean, I only honestly sort of started. I always thought that my experience with anorexia was kind of boring. Like I didn't know what to make of it. And I kind of like put it aside. And it wasn't until I went to Sweden and was writing about the children in Sweden who had sort of stopped eating that I felt like, oh, I kind of neglected the way that the diagnosis itself can sort of be a force exerting pressure or sort of shaping one's behavior. So I think for a long time I just assumed it was, and I'm sure that was a part of it too, was a response to like complicated family divorce. But it was when I went to Sweden and I started reading a lot of this philosopher of science, Ian Hacking, who writes about the looping effect, which is like, we think about diagnoses as something that just simply reflects what is in reality. And I became interested in, that looping effect. It doesn't just reflect, it also kind of changes behavior because we're human minds and we see how we are diagnosed, and that changes how we understand ourselves. So I think it was when I started thinking through that lens that I thought to revisit my experience with anorexia.
One of the things you wrote in the book, and I shared it with a friend of mine that's in recovery from anorexia, and it resonated with her, is that anorexia is a disease of math.
Well, it's often called a reading disease, which of course I found super interesting. Like a sort of misreading of the signs of our culture. But anorexia can be quite sort of boring, like you become obsessed with numbers. You become obsessed with how many ounces, how much do you weigh, how many calories are you eating? It becomes a kind of like, you can escape into this system, this like sort of new value system. And I, in the book, I kind of, when I'm thinking about why did I not have a trajectory of illness that Hava did, the older girl who was a kind of mentor, I sometimes wondered maybe it was as dumb as like I couldn't do the math. Like I just, it couldn't stick to me. I didn't have like it kind of couldn't get as into that value system.
All right, we will take one more question. Clelia, please.
First, I want to thank you. I think it's very brave that you're telling your story.
Thank you.
In your book and your research and in life, I'm sure you've seen a lot of treatments, from medication to rehab to incarceration. What do you think has been most effective?
Definitely not incarceration. There are, I think the thing that I felt most strongly about is that there's this desire to have like one explanation, one framework, one treatment modality that is going to be the cure. And explanations are not like mutually exclusive. Often it requires a few, and it's so specific to the individual. And like the thing that did feel dangerous was there's this temptation to just want one sweeping answer. But I mean, on a very basic level, I felt like the power of sort of connection between people who've had, like peer mentorship, people who have had similar experiences of mental illness, but even whether it's a library and just sort of a system that creates opportunities for alleviating loneliness, feels like a really big piece in addition to the more, medical approaches.
Well, thank you, Rachel Aviv.
Thank you.
I encourage everyone to read the book, but please do not try to drink Coca-Cola with your knees. And if you want to know what that means, read the book. Thank you.
Thank you so much.